Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to Guys of Magic. This is Hunter and David. Say what up, David.
Yo, what's going on?
We are back. This time we are taking a look at the Fey Dominion deck. That is the newest Precon deck from Wilds of Eldraine. David, you are the one upgrading this deck, so we are going to be doing the $100 upgrade. So before we get started, I just want to remind everybody to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, so you're staying up to date with not only all of these awesome deck techs, but all the other videos and the sequels to these for the $300 upgrade as well. But moving on to the video itself, David, talk to me about Fey Dominion. What is the deck about? What commander are you going with?
Yeah, so this deck looks like a ton of fun. So obviously, straight out of the box, this is primarily going to be a fairy deck. It's pretty heavily on the tribal theme. There are two legendary creature choices that we could potentially pick whenever it comes to a commander for this. The suggested one is going to be Tegwil, Duke of Splendor, and he is a blue and a black for a legendary creature fairy noble. He's a 2/3 with flying and death touch and says that other fairies you control get +1/+1. And it also says whenever another fairy you control dies, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. I think that this is a really powerful card, and I actually really do like this as a legendary creature, and potentially even at the helm of the deck. But the backup commander just speaks a little bit more to me here. So we're actually be jumping over and using her, which is Alela, Cunning Conqueror. She is 2, a blue, and a black for a total of 4 mana. She's a legendary creature fairy warlock. She's a 2/4 with flying and says whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, create a 1/1 black fairy rogue creature token with flying. She also says that whenever one or more fairies you control deal combat damage to a player, goad target creature that player controls. So she provides kind of a fun little play pattern where we want to mainly play on our opponent's turns. We can kind of mess with their combat by forcing their creatures to attack to our other opponents. So that's kind of a tricky little way for us to kind of like make sure that we're always interacting and we can manipulate the board state the way that we want it to be.
Yeah, okay. So Alela, the name of the game is hold up all your mana and just pray you never get hit, and then when you hit, you make the other creatures not hit you.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much exactly that. And then the majority of our creatures are fairies. So with that being said, most of which have flying, so we should be able to get in and just fly above. Occasionally, we might have to have one of our fairies die if our opponent has a flying blocker, but for the most part, that go trigger should be able to get through. Maybe we can goad our opponent's commanders, or just kind of like any other pesky creatures that we just want to have them swing at one of our opponents. And then also later on, that leaves them open for us to just hit them again and again and again because their blocker is going to be gone.
Gotcha. So it's Demir, don't touch me, I'm scared.
Kind of. It's more like Demir. I'm gonna mess with you while kind of just sitting back and doing my own thing. This deck is a lot of fun.
All right, I'm excited to see what you do with the deck. So let's go ahead and jump straight into your additions. First and foremost, what are we adding in to make this deck better?
So because we're going to be playing more around Alela and we want to be casting a lot of things with either flash or at instant speed, we're going to be pumping up our total amount of interaction here. And we got a couple of kill spells that I want to throw into the deck that were not previously included. So the first one here is Go for the Throat. This is 1 and a black for an instant that says destroy target non-artifact creature. It does have that kind of potential to miss, but I mean, most of the time, you're not going to be killing artifact creatures. So this will hit hopefully all of your opponent's commanders and most of their creatures. We also have Pongify, which is a single blue mana for an instant. It says destroy target creature. It can't be regenerated. Its controller creates a 3/3 green ape creature token. We are going to be giving them a creature here, but that creature doesn't have flying, so we don't really care about it. It's not going to be able to block our creatures. And I guess worst case scenario, we can always goad the monkey. Rapid Hybridization is very similar. This is a single blue mana for an instant that says destroy target creature. It can't be regenerated. That creature's controller creates a 3/3 green frog lizard creature token. Basically the same thing that I had to say about Pongify applies here as well. And then the last one of our kill spells we're going to be throwing in here is Infernal Grasp. This is 1 and a black for an instant that says destroy target creature. You lose 2 life. So we're mainly just going to be bumping up the total amount of interaction, the amount of kill spells here. And the best part is these are all instants, which means that Alela will be making fairies whenever our opponent's things are going to be dying.
Yeah, all four of these fantastic little removal spells. You can't get better in these colors. But how about some other counters?
Yeah, so we are going to be taking advantage of our color combination here. Obviously, we're going to be playing in blue, which means we have access to counter spells. So we're going to go ahead and start off by including the OG itself, Counter Spell, which is 2 blue mana for an instant that says counter target spell. It deals with anything that we need it to. Nice, short, simple, sweet, and also makes a fairy so long as Alela is in play. We're also going to be putting in Swan Song, which is a single blue mana for an instant that says counter target enchantment, instant, or sorcery spell. Its controller creates a 2/2 bird creature token with flying. Now, this one does have a little bit of a downside. They will be able to use that creature for blocks, and that's kind of an annoyance because our fairies, for the most part, are going to be 1/1s. Just kind of keep in mind, you want to mainly reserve Swan Song for countering your opponent's big splashy bombs. There's still definitely a place for this in the deck, especially considering this thing is only a single blue mana, but you are going to have to play around it. And then the last counter spell we're going to be putting in here is just good old-fashioned negate. This is 1 and a blue for an instant that says counter target non-creature spell. This will hit most things. It'll save you from a board wipe. It'll prevent your opponents from being able to get their planeswalkers in play. Negate does hit quite a bit, and it's one of my favorite counter spells in EDH.
Oh, man. I'm going to hate playing against this deck, aren't I?
I hope so.
We got destroy effects. We got counter effects. How about the mass removal effects? What do we got going on in that department?
Well, the mass removal effects, as it turns out, luckily, 2 big cards that are some of my favorite cards to play in Dimir just got reprinted. The first of which being Toxic Deluge, which is 2 and a black for a sorcery. It says, as an additional cost to cast a spell, you have to pay X life, and all creatures get -X until end of turn. Sadly, Toxic Deluge is a sorcery, not an instant, although that would be absolutely insane if it were. So no triggers off for Commander here, but I mean, generally speaking, if I am going to be pulling the trigger on a board wipe, it's probably because my commander has either died or my opponents were just kind of overwhelming me in terms of value. So Toxic Deluge is one of the best board wipes that you can play in the format, so we're going to be throwing it in this list. And then, of course, it doesn't really get any better than it. We have Cyclonic Rift in our $100 upgrade here. This is 1 and a blue for an instant that says return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. Or you can overload it for 6 and a blue, and if you do, you return all of your opponent's non-land permanents back to their hands. Cyclonic Rift is a fantastic card. It kind of serves as a one-sided board wipe, but it also cleans up their mana rocks, their enchantments, planeswalkers, anything that they have like that. And then, assuming that we do have a commander in play and a couple of fairies, we hopefully should be able to really abuse our opponent's rebuilding by just goading all of their things from that point on and really taking advantage of that wide open board state.
Yeah, like you said, Toxic Deluge and Cyclonic Rift. Awesome that they just got reprinted in Commander Masters. Gives us the flexibility of adding these to our 100 lists now instead of our 300 lists. So, fantastic inclusions. But those are all the instants and sorceries I see. Let's talk about a potential enchantment that was not in the Precon itself.
Yeah, so I don't think this is going to be any surprise, but we are going to be including Bitter Blossom. This is 1 and a black for a tribal enchantment fairy. This is a fairy spell itself, but it doesn't necessarily actually matter so much for this deck. It does say at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and you create a 1/1 black fairy rogue creature token with flying. So over the course of the game, this is going to hurt you. You are going to lose life for this, but you're going to be able to make a ton of little 1/1 flyers off of it. And that's just going to be added fuel for our fire. That gives us more creatures, more abilities for us to swing in and go to our opponent's creatures. So Bitter Blossom is a slam dunk of a card. If you have this in your opening hand, drop it on turn 2. You're going to absolutely love it.
Yeah, and once again, we were just talking about reprints. This was actually just reprinted in the Enchanting Tales version of Wilds of Eldraine. So if you open a pack, hopefully you get one of these and throw it into the Precon itself. Now it's time to talk some fairies, David. What are we adding in the fairy department for your fairy tribal deck?
Yeah, so this is kind of weird because although this is a fairy tribal deck, our commander is going to be making a lot of the fairies, so we don't actually have to have a super high density of them. I'm actually going to only be including 4 fairies in this list. We're mainly going to be focusing on the fact that we can play around our opponent's turns. The first fairy I'm going to be throwing in here is Fairy Mastermind. This is 1 and a blue for a creature fairy rogue. It is a 2/1 with flash and flying. And it says whenever an opponent draws their second card each turn, you draw a card. It's also got an ability where you can pay 3 and a blue, and each player draws a card. I love this. Not only is this a fairy, but this thing having flash also triggers our commander, assuming we didn't cast this on our turn.
Yeah, Fairy Mastermind. Currently in standard right now and sees a ton of play. Just that ability is so good.
Up next, we have Una's Blackguard. This is 1 and a black for a creature fairy rogue. It is a 1/1 with flying. Sadly, no flash on this one. It says that each other rogue creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, and whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card. So it doesn't actually care about fairies, but if you check over the list, almost half of our fairies are rogues. Bitter Blossom makes fairy rogues, and our commander makes fairy rogues. So this is a card that actually has the potential to really get out of control. And I mean, just like think about that perfect board state. Swinging in, being able to not only go to our opponent's creatures, but then also making them discard cards every time our fairies connect.
That is so mean. I don't like that, Dave.
Yeah, and then on the bright side, if they do manage to, I don't know, cast a spell, we can always counter it or kill it.
That seems like the perfect world, right?
Absolutely. Love it. We have two other fairies I want to talk about, the first of which being Spell Stutter Sprite. This is 1 and a blue for a creature fairy wizard. It is a 1/1 with flash and flying. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, counter target spell with converted mana cost of X or less, where X is the number of fairies you control. So, obviously, if you've got a couple fairies in play, use this as a counter spell. And it's a body itself that could potentially also trigger your commander. I love this card.
Yeah, it's a very good card. I love it as well.
And then, kind of in a similar vein here, we have Vendilion Click. This is 1 and 2 blue for a legendary creature fairy wizard. It is a 3/1 with flash and flying, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, look at target player's hand. You may choose a non-land card from it, and if you do, that player reveals the chosen card, puts it on the bottom of his or her library, then draws a card. So, sadly, they're not at a net negative for this. They are going to replace that card, but you can flash this in, say, for example, when your opponent decided to demonic tutor or something, put a card into their hand, take a quick peek, and then put that card that they just grabbed on the bottom of their library. Vendilion Click is fantastic.
Yeah, that would be a really mean effect after a tutor.
And then the last creature we're going to throw in here is sadly not a fairy. In fact, it's actually kind of a fish. This is Wavebreak Hippocamp. This is 2 and a blue for an enchantment creature horse fish. It's a 2/2, but it does say whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turns, draw a card, which just works so well with this deck, so I had to include it.
Yeah, not a fairy, but the horse fish seems like a really good include in it.
Also, can we talk real quick about the fact that this is a horse fish and not a seahorse?
You know, you don't have a creature type C, so horse fish it is.
Okay, but you know what? Seahorse could have been one word. I feel like this is a missed opportunity.
I don't know. Horse fish, though. Still fun to say. Let's move on to a potential really good artifact in this deck. What are you putting in here?
So I'm going to be throwing Skull Clamp in this list. Our commander makes a ton of little 1/1 flyers, and Skull Clamp is a fantastic draw engine if we have small tokens. For a single mana, we get an artifact equipment that says the equipped creature gets +1/-1, but it also says whenever the equipped creature dies, we draw 2 cards and it has an equip cost of just 1. So what we could do is we could put this on one of our fairy tokens. Our fairy token sadly will die, but we'll draw 2 cards from it, which is a wonderful value.
Yeah. Yeah. You're making 1/1s, you're killing the 1/1s, you're drawing 2 cards. The synergy here is too good not to include Skull Clamp.
Yep.
And finally, let's talk mana base. What are we doing with your lands?
So we had a little bit of the budget left over, and I did want to address the mana base. Although I will actually admit, straight out of the box, this mana base is not that bad. It's actually pretty straightforward. We do have room for 2 cards, though, and the first one I wanted to throw in is Drowned Catacomb. This is a land that says it enters the battlefield tapped unless you control an island or a swamp, and you can tap it for either a blue or a black. For the most part, you're going to be able to meet that clause. Drowned Catacomb will enter the battlefield untapped, I guess maybe 80% of the time. So I actually really do love this card. The second card is Watery Grave. This is a land that is both an island and a swamp. You can tap it for either a blue or a black, and it says that as it enters the battlefield, you may pay 2 life. If you don't, it enters the battlefield tapped. So if you need access to the mana right away, you can lose the 2 life, shock yourself, and you're good to go with Watery Grave. And if you don't need the mana right away, you can just have it enter the battlefield tapped, so it does provide that flexibility.
Yeah, simple to the point. If you're running the colors, find these types of lands in your colors and throw them in. They're really good. But is that going to do it? Is that all your additions for this $100 upgrade?
That is all the additions for this $100 upgrade.
All right, well, I liked all of those additions. They seemed really good. But, of course, now's the time that everybody kind of winces at. It's the removal time. What are we cutting to make room for all those awesome additions?
So this deck is a little bit odd because we are going to be playing around with Alela. We actually don't need to include quite as many fairies, and as it turns out, a couple of the fairies that are included in the deck are just kind of bad. So we're going to be trimming the fat a little bit whenever it comes to that. I don't want you guys at home to freak out. This is still very much so a tribal fairy deck. We're just really trying to up our amount of interaction, mainly just kind of limit our opponent's creatures and keep our stuff alive. So we are going to be cutting a couple fairies, and the first of which is Fairy Seer. This is a single blue mana for a creature fairy wizard. It is a 1/1 with flying and says whenever it enters the battlefield, scry 2. That is a powerful effect, but it doesn't have flash. It can't trigger on our commander, and for the most part, it really doesn't do a whole lot. This is still going to take up a card slot in the deck, and I just felt like it kind of didn't warrant it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm just gonna say it, it's a common for a reason.
Yeah, the next card kind of fell victim for the same reason. This is Cloud of Fairies. It's 1 and a blue for a creature fairy. It's a 1/1 with flying and says whenever it enters the battlefield, untap up to 2 lands. And then it's got a cycling cost of 2. This is in the deck because well, it's a fairy, it's got flying, and I guess it kind of pseudo pays you back the 2 mana that you spent on this. So it's pseudo free, but I don't know if I want to spend 2 mana on a 1/1.
The only good thing for these two is to die to Skull Clamp. They're just not that good.
You know, casting an instant that kills our opponent's commander makes a fairy that also dies to Skull Clamp too, though.
Even better.
The next one here is Quickling. This is 1 and a blue for a creature fairy rogue. It's a 2/2. It has that magic keyword of flash, and it has flying. But then it says whenever it enters the battlefield, you have to sacrifice it unless you return another creature you control to its owner's hand. Now, I know that, yes, ideally you would be able to bring something back to your hand. That way you can reuse its ETB or maybe take it out on another adventure later on. But I just felt for the most part, Quickling was kind of awkward and a little clunky. It's a 2-drop, but it doesn't actually get cast on turn 2. You kind of want to save it in your hand for later on. And it does kind of come into some cool interaction if you do use this to bounce a creature back to your hand. Maybe save it from your opponent's removal or maybe a board wipe. But Quickling just, it always kind of felt a little awkward in my hand, so I did decide to cut it. The next 2 cards I kind of grappled with a little bit. There's a reason why I actually really do like them, but I decided ultimately the fairy portion of the card just wasn't quite good enough. So the first card here is Hypnotic Sprite, which also happens to be an adventure. The adventure portion of the card is Mesmeric Glare, which is 2 and a blue for an instant, and it says counter target spell with converted mana cost 3 or less. The creature portion of this card is 2 blue mana for a 2/1 with flying. So, I mean, it does kind of everything that we want. It has an instant stapled onto the card. It's got interaction. This is a fairy. I, for the most part, just wasn't really super in love with the counterspell ability on the card. It's a little bit more restrictive, only being able to counter something that has a lower mana value, here in this case of 3 or less. It still will come up and be relevant over the course of a game. I just felt, you know what, for the most part, I would rather just include good old counterspell in this list because I'm guaranteeing I'm going to be able to counter what I need to counter then.
Yeah, that stipulation there is, if you draw this late game, you might be holding on to it a little too long.
Yeah, and then the other card here is Picklock Prankster. This also has an adventure, which is Free the Fae, which is 1 and a blue. It is an instant, and it says mill 4 cards, then put an instant sorcery or fairy card from among the milled cards into your hand. I'm not the biggest fan of these kinds of effects. There is the potential that I just whiff, and this actually just doesn't do anything for me. There is also the potential that I mill a couple cards that I otherwise would have liked to have used. So I'm not really the biggest fan of these kinds of effects. It's just not something that I like to play around with. And then the creature portion of this, for 1 and a blue, so a total of 2 mana, you get a 1/3 with flying and vigilance. It just really wasn't doing a whole lot for me, so this was another card that I just decided wasn't worth it.
Yeah, it makes sense. These adventures aren't the best adventures.
We're going to be cutting 2 more fairies, the first of which is Nightveil Sprite. This is 1 and a blue for a creature fairy rogue. It is a 1/2 with flying and says whenever it attacks, you surveil 1. This is a cool effect. I definitely like the surveil aspect of things. It's not really netting you card advantage or card draw, but at least it's kind of helping you to sculpt your hand. We also don't really have any kind of like graveyard play or shenanigans whenever it comes to this deck, so I don't see much of an impact in why it is we would intentionally want to be putting things into the graveyard. This, for the most part, it's 2 mana for a 1/2 flyer that occasionally triggers off of our commander. And then the last fairy I'm going to be removing is Nettling Nuisance. This is one of the brand new cards that was just printed for this list. This is 2 and a black for a creature fairy rogue. It is a 3/1 with flying and says whenever one or more fairies you control deal combat damage to a player, that player creates a 4/2 red pirate creature token with this creature can't block. The token is goaded for the rest of the game. This card sounds really cool. And whenever I first saw this get spoiled, I was really high on it. However, the more that I started to mess around with this deck, the more I started to realize that, wait a second, we're going to be giving our opponents quite a bit of pirates. Because they're always attacking, they're not blocking, they may not necessarily be dying. And whenever it comes down to the end of the game and it's just us versus one opponent, I don't really want them to be beating us to death with an army of 4/2s that we gave them over the course of the game. So not only Nooses is a weird card, but I decided because of the potential downside there, it's actually a card I had to cut.
Very interesting that it makes pirates. I don't know the flavor on that.
I don't know the flavor either, and actually even just from the artwork, I feel like the fairies in this set are kind of all over the place. Like this one has like hawk wings. It's I don't know if it looks like a fairy to me.
It's definitely different, but I can see why you cut these cards. That makes sense. But we did add a ton of instants. What instants are we taking out?
Yeah, so we kind of upped our removal package. We upped our interaction. So we're going to be mainly just kind of cutting some of the cards that I felt weren't really quite good enough to make the cut. The first card we're going to be removing is Reckless Spite. This is 1 and 2 black for an instant that says destroy 2 target non-black creatures. You lose 5 life. This card is cute. However, there has to be at least 2 non-black creatures that we want to remove for this to do anything. And losing 5 life is kind of steep. I am not a big fan of this.
Anytime a card doesn't say up to is always getting cut in my eyes.
Yeah, I don't know. This is I think this card might just actually be bad. Up next, we have Perplexing Test. This is 3 and 2 blue, total of 5 mana for an instant that says choose 1. Return all creature tokens to their owner's hands, or return all non-token creatures to their owner's hands. This is like a board wipe that still hurts us. It still affects us because we have both non-token and token creatures. And then we're faced with not dealing with all of our opponents' things if our opponents are playing tokens. So, like, it's more expensive than most board wipes that I like to play and does less. I don't like this card.
It wants to be a protection spell, but at the same time, doesn't completely protect you.
Yeah, it's just it wants to do a lot, but it doesn't really do anything well. We're going to be cutting Thrilling Encore. This is 4 and a black for a total of 5 mana. It is an instant and says put onto the battlefield under your control all creature cards in all graveyards that were put there from the battlefield this turn. This card sounds like it has a massive amount of upside, and if we can use this card to follow up a board wipe, it puts us in a really commanding position. However, this costs 5, which means we're probably not going to be able to afford to cast a board wipe and then cast this thing. That's a ton of mana. So ultimately, I just decided I don't really want super situational cards that are going to be just kind of like dead and sitting in my hand unless my opponents do something very specific. I know that, yes, of course, obviously, somebody's probably going to cast a board wipe over the course of the game, and this can be a huge payoff card in the case that that happens. I just don't like the fact that this also has the potential to do literally nothing, and it's kind of expensive.
Yeah, and the strategy you're going with, you're making a bunch of tokens on your board, so it's not like you can bring those tokens back anyways.
Yeah.
All right, I understand all those instant cuts. I see some sorcery cuts as well. What are we getting rid of?
This deck has so much mass removal, and I really don't understand it because we kind of want to go wide and we slowly make tokens. So I don't really know why it has so much, but we're going to be removing more mass removal. The first card here that I want to talk about is Nightmare Unmaking. This is 3 and 2 black for a sorcery. It says choose 1. Exile each creature with power greater than the number of cards in your hand, or exile each creature with power less than the number of cards in your hand. For me, for the most part, this is kind of in the same line as Perplexing Test, except for this one's a sorcery, which makes it kind of a little bit worse. I don't really want to ever just choose one. I want my board wipes to just kill everything and not have to worry about additional stipulations. So this card was an easy cut.
Yeah, this card doesn't seem very good.
And then the last card, as far as like mass removal that I'm going to be getting rid of, is Kindred Dominance. This is 5 and 2 black for a sorcery. It says choose a creature type, destroy all creatures that aren't of the chosen type. In a deck like this, obviously we're going to be naming fairies, so this could serve as a one-sided board wipe. Ultimately, this is a 7-mana card, though. I don't like 7-mana cards. I do not like cards that are this expensive, and I feel like for the most part, this is just going to sit around in my hand as a dead card. Occasionally come in and it'll be clutch, but we're going to be killing our opponents by making our opponents beat each other to death with the goated creatures. And if we cast Kin of Dominance, they don't have any goated creatures anymore. So we're going to kill them with our, I don't know, 4 total power of flying creatures. This is just, it's a card that sounds really good. It just doesn't play that well.
Sometimes you just got to cut the curve down, and it makes sense with these 2 cards. Moving on to another permanent card. What are we getting rid of?
Yeah, so if you checked out our spoiler videos whenever we were going through the set, we talked about this card, and I actually wasn't a big fan of it then. I'm still not really that big of a fan of it now, and it is Misleading Signpost. This is an artifact that costs 2 and a blue. It does have flash, which is kind of neat, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield during the declare attacker step, you may reselect which player or permanent target attacking creature is attacking, and you can tap it for a blue. So this kind of acts as like a one-time combat trick type style of card, and then later on we can use this just as a good old-fashioned mana rock. My problem here being is I like my mana rocks to come down early, and this is a card that is going to sit in my hand for me to have a good opportunity to use that redirection. Also, we're going to be goading our opponent's creatures, so if our deck is working correctly, we shouldn't have to actually ever use that ability. I don't know. I just found that this was a card that, like, it wanted to be played in the early game, it wanted to be played in the late game, but it never actually, like, did its thing very well.
I am a big fan of this card myself, but in the deck that you're building, I can see why you took this out. And finally, we did talk about you adding a couple lands. Looks like we're removing some as well.
We are going to be cutting down the total number of lands for this deck. This Precon came with 40 lands straight out of the box, which is a bit on the higher side, especially considering our mana curve is really not that high. Most of our spells kind of fall within about the 1 to 3 mana range. So I don't know why it has so many lands, but if anything, that's just kind of nice because cutting lands is super easy. So that's exactly what we're going to do. The first card that we're going to be removing here is Myriad Landscape. This is one of my least favorite lands of all time, and it seems to pop up in every single precon, so thank you, Wizards, for giving me an easy out here and just removing this. It enters the battlefield tapped. It taps for a colorless, and then later on you can pay 2 mana, tap it, sacrifice it, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards that share a land type, put them onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. I know that people love this card. This card is not
one
good.
of them.
Steven can be one of them. Steven can love this card. This enters the battlefield tap, so it does nothing the turn that it comes in. And then later on, I have to use 2 mana, most likely from 2 other sources, 2 other lands, and tap this for it to do its thing. That is 4 opportunities for me to tap something else for mana. This card is just I'm not here for this card.
Yeah, I've always looked at it like taking off a turn, obviously, when it's coming in tap, but you're paying 3 mana sources to get 1 extra land.
Yeah. I mean, if anything, taking a single turn, I feel like it would even be a miscalculation because it's going to eat the following turn too.
Mm-hmm.
And then to follow up Myriad Landscape, probably my actual least favorite land of all time is Temple of the False God. This is a land that'll sit in your hand and make you really sad whenever you draw it. It can tap for 2 colorless mana, but it says activate this ability only if you control 5 or more lands. And it checks itself, so technically you only have to have 4 other lands. That's cool. But Temple of the False God, whenever it's included in a deck, is almost guaranteed to be in my opening hand. And that makes me so sad because this does nothing until you have 5 lands.
Yeah, I feel you on that one. Temple of the False God. Every time I bust out a new precon, it's always that first card I drop on the top of my opening hand. Makes me sad.
Yeah, the card is awful. It's an easy remove. Don't play Temple of the False God. Speaking about another temple that I'm not a big fan of, we have Temple of Deceit. This is a land that enters the battlefield tapped 100% of the time. And it says whenever it enters the battlefield, scry 1. Later on, of course, you can tap it for either a blue or a black, so at least this one taps for color that we need. I don't like enter the battlefield tapped lands, ever. I would almost guarantee just prefer to have a basic land. I get that, yeah, sure, there's a time and a place if I am in like a dedicated scry deck, but I'm not. I don't like this card. this card goes away. Next, we have Demir Aqueduct. This is a land that also will always enter the battlefield tapped, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, return a land you control to its owner's hand, and you can tap it for both a blue and a black. This sounds really cool, and if you are playing in a deck that like wants to utilize this graveyard, there are some kind of fun interactions that you can use this cycle of lands for. But I kind of look at it like this. I just don't like lands that come into the battlefield that are all slow like this. This one also bounces a land back to your hand, so it's really not even like netting you positive in terms of mana. And then the last thing here being is if your opponent does happen to have any land removal, if they're thinking they're cute and they included like a strip miner, a ghostly quarter, or something like that in their list, these cards are magnets for land destruction because your opponent is kind of two for wanting you whenever they blow this thing up. So I'm not a fan of these cards. There's a time and a place for them. I will give it that, but unless you are really playing in a graveyard deck where you're like utilizing the fact that you have to bounce something and then maybe going over your max hand size, no, I don't like it.
It's not the time nor the place.
Nope. And then the last card that we are going to be removing from this is Tainted Isle. This is a land that enters the battlefield untapped, which is awesome, and I love that. You can tap for a colorless, or you can tap it for either a blue or a black and activate only if you control a swamp. Now, this card on paper sounds pretty dope. All you got to do is just get that swamp in play. However, I don't know what happens with my luck, but about 99.9% of the time that I draw one of these lands, I never see that corresponding basic land type. So this just only ever taps for a colorless every time I play it.
It makes sense. You had 40 lands. You cut down a couple more than what you're adding. Bringing that total down, we saw you lower the curve, so we don't need as many lands. But is that going to do it for all of the cards for your $100 list?
Yeah, that's going to do it. This deck, honestly, straight out of the box, I do recommend it. This deck looks like a ton of fun. With the upgrades, this deck is, I don't know, it fits directly into the kind of play style that I really love to play. So just kind of sit back, let your opponents beat themselves to death. And then whenever they do end up doing a thing that you don't like, you have so much interaction to just get rid of it. I love this kind of style of play. Alela, I think, is a fantastic commander. And for those of you who were keen enough with it, I did actually keep the backup commander in this list, which I typically don't do. Did like that card, especially in a list like this one, too.
That's awesome. Well, let's ask the question. We gave you $100 to upgrade the deck. After all of your additions, what did the total amount come out to be?
This is a $100 upgrade, and keep in mind that as of the time of this recording, the total upgrade cost is actually $101.38. Now, cards can fluctuate in price. They generally do. If people are going to go pick this up, they're probably going to go pick up a couple of the fairies or maybe things like Bitter Blossom that just got a reprint. So that one can kind of fluctuate in price a little bit too. As of right now, this is a little bit, just $1 over that $100 budget.
That's awesome, man. I'll give it to you. A little over, but I believe once because, like you said, at the time of recording this set has not been released yet. So I assume Bitter Blossom having a reprint in this set will actually probably come down in price just a bit. But before we wrap up, David, do you want to have any final thoughts to the people?
I mean, final thoughts, just closing things whenever it comes to this deck. Go out, pick it up. I do highly recommend this one. I think this is a slam dunk of a Precon. I love this deck.
Yeah, this deck is a lot of fun, it seems. I am pretty terrified when we do our battle, which probably won't come out until the Ixalan sets come out as well. So stay tuned for that, which means subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. You don't want to miss out on any cool content, as well as your $300 upgrade, which also is coming soon. Also, check the description down below where you will find the entire deck list for this deck on the Moxfield account. Go ahead and try it for yourself. But hit that like button. If you check the description, you will find links to our Twitter, our Instagram, and our TikTok. That's at Guys of Magic for each one. Follow us on those as well. Comment down below. Did you guys like David's upgrade? What do you think he missed? Did you think he took something out that maybe he shouldn't have? Let us know. Always interested in hearing your guys' opinions. And until the next video, hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Peace.
Later.